the way we were training, the way we were executing, the way we were leading, mentoring when I was that fighter pilot in our military units and flying organizations. We didn't know it at the time, but a lot of the things we did and how we trained, we learned that based on experience, but it really had a lot of human factors at play there.
Welcome to Engage Presents. I'm Engage co-founder and president Jake Olson. In this interview series, I ask Engage talent the most common questions we hear from event planners to help you get to know them and their stories in 15 minutes or less. Thanks for listening. Welcome to another episode of Engage Presents. I'm Engage president Jake Olson. Alongside me today, a very special guest, an honorable man himself, Brandon Williams. Brandon is a former fighter pilot, a professor, a safety leadership and human factors expert. Brandon, first, thank you so much for your service and for all that you've put into your career, protecting us and just being the cool badass you are.
Well, Jake, I appreciate that. And thanks for the time. Thanks for the conversation. And as I said, we were talking earlier, but I appreciate the partnership with Engage as well. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Love helping you. And so let's get into a little bit here. Like I said, I mentioned one of the coolest things about you, fighter pilot. You've led teams in some of the highest stake environments imaginable. Is there one moment or maybe a couple moments that stand out in your career that you just, really take a step back saying, did I really do that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. It's, when I think about it, there's probably several moments when I look back on my career during that time in my life. Obviously, everything I speak on, my human factors leadership model and working with teams in very high reliability, high stakes industries, using, thinking about those times when we had to lead and execute in uncertainty and complex environments. So a lot of examples, but since you asked, one of the ones, I actually start most of my keynotes kind of with this opening story of, I remember, back in 2005 when a little younger then and young fighter pilot flying over the skies of Iraq, we were in a situation where there were some friendly forces on the ground who were in a very bad predicament. And myself and my wingman of the jet and our airplane I flew had a back seat, that picture right there behind me. And our backseaters, our weapon systems officers, and we got called into this situation. And I tell this story about, just all the chaos and complexity when we get on site, trying to find where the friendlies are, where the enemy is. There's weather we got to deal with, we're running low on gas. We got to get the air to refueling tanker there. We're trying to find out, like I said, where the friendlies are, how we can support them the right way. And then we're trying to coordinate with other air assets. And then we're trying to fly this F-15 that has, what I always say, these 200 switches, dials, and displays, and all the sounds and bells and whistles coming at you. And so, the human mind was, as we all know, is never designed right for those kind of environments. And so I always say, and I set that up. And thankfully, by the way, we did, because of our training, because of mutual support, because of how our continuous improvement culture we had, we could drive a positive outcome on that mission and save the lives of some of those Marines that day, which is truly rewarding and probably one of the most rewarding sorties I've ever had. But I set that up because I say, hey, look, you may not be flying a $200, $150 million, fighter aircraft, or you may not be pulling 9Gs or flying 400 miles per hour daily in your office. But, the teams I work with, your worlds are very similar, right? There's a lot of changes, a lot of complexity, a lot of, whether it's emails, calls, and meetings, or maybe you're a frontline leader concerned about the safety of your people, and you work in these environments where there's a lot of variables and change. And so how we deal with that and how we understand that, I set that up because my point is, your world is really no different. Yeah. So that's really the one story I like to kind of start off with a lot of times in my keynote, because it really takes the audience into that environment, right? And really shows them, how it relates to their world, I think.
Absolutely. No, and thank you for sharing that. So let's talk about human factors a little bit. When I first kind of read that about you, I'm like, what is it? And so I want you to kind of explain it, and then how can people and teams take that concept? And as you mentioned, you do relate it to the regular individual's daily life in, the whatever, their house or their office. So how can they apply it to that type of environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I kind of mentioned earlier, we kind of introduced the the fighter pilot part of my background and why that's important to my methodology. But the other piece is the human factors. And I combine both of those because, what I did as a fighter pilot and in aviation is kind of the, what we did and how those worlds were similar to my audiences. But the human factors piece is the science behind it. And I always say, the way we were training, the way we were executing, the way we were leading, mentoring when I was that fighter pilot in our military units and flying organizations. We didn't know it at the time, but a lot of the things we did and how we trained, we learned that based on experience, but it really had a lot of human factors at play there. What do I mean by that? Well, human factors is really the study. It's typically associated with engineering, right? So, these laptops we use, the cars we drive, the airplanes I flew, all that stuff has human factors engineering, how the human's going to interact with that piece of technology. And so we talk about that, we design all these products, but I don't think we ever talk about it enough when we talk about how we lead and design our teams. So from my mindset, human factors, and this is based on, again, I've taught this for over 15 years now at several universities as well. And then when I was in the Air Force, I was an Air Force aviation safety officer, which meant I was qualified to investigate, aircraft mishaps, right, when something would happen. And what that always went back to was human factors. And so why humans make certain decisions in certain environments, right? So when we get in those uncertain, complex, chaotic environments I was talking about earlier, what do? We all, as humans, we respond in different ways, right? We can get tunnel vision, we can stress and pressure take over, which can definitely affect our decision making, right? Which is critically important to people in these industries I work with. Or you talk about mental and physical fatigue. We talk about poor communication. Basically how these environments we work in, how it affects us as humans.
No, yeah, that's awesome application there. And you kind of mentioned it in that answer a little bit, but in those environments, the high stake, high leverage environments, you can kind of say that mistakes are inevitable, right? That people are going to
Right.
be, forcing those decisions,
Absolutely.
and some of those decisions will be wrong. But what kind of strategies do you help them take to make sure that they're still remaining calm or performing at their best, despite maybe not every decision going the best?
Absolutely. Well, there's kind of four main parts to that. And to sum that up, it starts with number one, what I call clear intent, which is clear intent is a, narrow focus on what is most important, for your team or your organization, however you define that. So whether you're a CEO of a large, company team, or maybe a small frontline leader, what is the clear intent for your team? In other words, what I call it is, what is your prioritization? What are the priorities you want your people to think about when they make highly autonomous decisions? Because typically, if we don't have that, a lot of people call it alignment. Some people kind of relate it to the why behind what we do and that kind of stuff. But if you don't have that clear intent, I call it, just like when I was a fighter pilot out there with my wingman, very young in my 20s, making these decisions in a highly autonomous environment where literally, bad things can happen if we make the wrong decisions. But we were trusted to do that because we had a very clear intent. What our commanders and clear intent was, hey, here's our priorities for our mission here. This is what we're trying to do. You go out and make decisions that are aligned around that. And I trust you to do that. So that's the first thing, is clear intent. Then it comes back to situational awareness. How do we, situational awareness is really the awareness of all those variables affecting our current state at that current time. So flying that jet and all those different variables I was talking about, how do we know what's important at the right time? Which comes back to, there's a lot of things, but training, experience, but also before we even walk out the door, briefing and ensuring where, we know what our areas of vulnerability are, I call it, where we're going to have gaps, where we're going to have potentially missteps. And then mutual support, which is very deep level peer accountability. So, Harvard Business Review has done studies, and they said the highest performing teams, the lowest or poorest performing teams, there's no accountability, no shocker there. In good teams or average teams, typically managers, bosses run accountability. But in the highest performance team, it's a deep level peer accountability. But, not the kind of accountability where, hey, I'm looking to, catch you, Jake, doing something wrong, and I'm going to turn you in, or that type of thing. Because when I think accountability, I think it also, a lot of times it gets a negative connotation, kind of, do this or else. But it's a deep level mutual support where it's not that I'm just concerned about my performance, but Jake, I want you to do well because, I know you, I know I know something about your family, probably. We hang out together, we know each other. So I want you to look good as much as I want myself to look good and the team to do good. Right. And so how do you embed that? So that's really how we also make those better decisions with a deep level mutual support and peer accountability. And then finally, striving for that debrief culture, which is what I talked about earlier, which is really after every time we execute, no matter where we had success or failure, we always debrief. And why do we debrief? And it's a specific way on how we debrief. It's not just talking about, let's go talk about this. It's a structured model, how we set up a tone of accountability so we're not afraid to speak up. And then also, how do we really dig into that root cause analysis so we can really find those gaps? And that's probably one of the biggest tools, when I talk about how we perform at such high levels as fighter pilots in those environments. It was because of that debrief. And it was such a big part of how we, our culture and how we execute and how we did business. So those kind of four main parts, I think: clear intent, situational awareness, mutual support, and then that debrief culture, I think is the best ways I help people drive, better decision making for their teams.
So let's talk lastly here about, okay, you go through that process and now you come up with the the next steps and the course correction. And I want to know, like, is there a time where you had to be courageous enough to take those steps and course correct? And what goes into that? Because I think a lot of people lose either motivation or lose confidence or whatever it is when they have to course correct.
Oh yeah, I mean, where do I even begin? Which one do I take? Where I had to course correct or failed, or I look back, so many areas. Whether it was I graduated high school, went to the Air Force Academy. I mean, that was extremely challenging there. Just 4 years of school, but also just a lot of things that they put you under in those kind of pressure factories to kind of get you prepared for that world. So I think of areas there where there were times I'm like, I didn't think I was going to make it or wasn't sure if I was going to make it. And, had to really, kind of start then, learning about self-debriefing and where are my areas, and start learning then, hey, and they do that for a reason, because they want you to lean on, your classmates at the time when I was in school, right? They want you to lean, because that they're trying to instill that mutual support that I talked about earlier, because they knew how important that was. When I say they, leadership knew how important that was in the world you're going to. So that was kind of where you first start embracing that mutual support. Then going on to Air Force pilot training, again, a very intense year-long effort where there's times when you start wondering, man, am I going to make it or not? Because this is extremely challenging with a fairly good washout rate at times. And so you really have to there. It was a even bigger piece of leaning on the people you're going through training with, right? And they set it up that way because they know that if you're not understanding that now, that's the world you're going to, right? That you have to be able to work as a team. You've got to be able to learn from each other, because the instructors don't have enough time to teach everything. And then when you're out there executing one day in combat, you're going to have to lean on other people when you don't see all the answers, or, you can't do everything at once. So I think learning, course correcting, learning to lean on others, learning to learn from others, learning that also, because getting to that level, the higher up you go, going out of Air Force pilot training, going to learn to fly the F-15, going in these intense environments, getting out, going, becoming a major airline pilot, going to a completely different world, starting a business, what I'm doing now. I mean, so many different things change. I mean, starting a business, I mean, man, how many times I had to course correct in this world, really leaning on people like, how do I do marketing? Help me, people helping me with that, teams like yours that can help me, drive business development, and leaning on people, learning how to speak and how to tell a story better, how to develop content. There's just so many things that I think I had to learn. That was the biggest piece, though, whenever I course corrected, was who can I lean on, who can I or turn to help me.
Well, that's powerful. I mean, it puts the emphasis on who we are to each other and the people you surround yourself with, and that's absolutely powerful. And so we appreciate that insight. And you mentioned us, but we absolutely are honored to be in that team, that people who you can lean on to drive these messages home to whoever books you. And that's the next thing here. If you want to book Brandon or check out his profile, learn more about who he is and what he speaks about, you can visit letsengage.com. And again, check all that out there. Brandon, thank you again so much for joining us today and just sharing a little bit about your life and what you've learned, man. It's fascinating, it's powerful, and we just really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jake. I appreciate it. Thanks again for the time.
Stay tuned for more Engage Presents.